All right, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to Take Charge for May of 2017. So I think everybody knows that with our graduate programming here through Take Charge, there are a number of things that we try and accomplish with these sessions. We encourage people to do their exercise and to follow all the heart-healthy habits and lifestyle things that we do through cardiac rehab. We try and do an awful lot of education. Of course, we do that on a monthly basis. And the other thing that we do is we really enjoy this because it provides an opportunity for everybody to get together with their peers and just mingle and talk and all that kind of thing. I'm a big believer that that's a very, very good and healthy thing to do. Well, tonight, we've got a speaker who's going to actually prove that that's the case. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Shalom Gluberman, a graduate of the program, I can say that, right? Indeed. Which is excellent. And you might have seen him because he does attend Take Charge on a fairly regular basis. Dr. Gluberman is the only PhD philosopher that I know. He's the philosopher at Baycrest, right? The in-house philosopher there. And he was also a big advocate for patient support groups. And you started the...
I founded Patient Canada.
Patient Canada. So a big advocate for that. So tonight we're very fortunate. Dr. Gluberman is going to share with us all the evidence that surrounds being well-connected socially and how that impacts not only on quality of life, but mortality and heart health and all that kind of good stuff. Dr. Gluberman, thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to give very much evidence, so Rob is a bit off. What I'm going to do is present an argument for something, so that's much more philosophical than scientific. So we'll have to see whether or not that works. I'm going to talk about the way in which we have come to understand ourselves and our bodies, and talk about how that started and how it has affected heart patients especially, and how this is beginning to change. And what we expect to have happen in the future. I mean, how that's going to change the way in which I think heart patients and other patients behave and what they understand about their condition and about things that will make it better. So I'm going to try to do that by talking about the origins, first of all, of what our current medical model is. The way we think about our bodies and the way we think about these in medicine really started with the thinking of a man who lived in the 15th century and in the 16th century. His name was Paracelsus. His full name is Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. And it's a pleasure to say it, so if you'd like to say it, you can try. Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. It's a pleasure. So just to say his name. And he's quite famous. He didn't have very much of a following until this century, but they found out a lot more about him. What he's famous for, what he has been famous for, is that he became the town doctor in a town in Switzerland, and he burned the books of Galen, who had developed the earlier medical model, a medical model of the four humors, which you may have heard of. And he burned it. He thought that it was completely mistaken. He didn't believe in the Greek elements. He didn't believe in the humors that Galen was arguing for. And he believed that the body was something like a chemical retort, and that the chemicals in it, if they were properly there, would keep you healthy. And that if you were sick, it was a result of poison or because some of the chemicals that are supposed to be in your body were missing, or there were too many of them. So his idea of health was a kind of well-established chemical reaction, a series of chemical reactions, and he became an itinerant doctor after he burnt those books because they fired him from his job, and he got to meet lots of people and influence them with his ideas, and he had a tremendous impact on the century after him, which was the century of the scientific revolution. Descartes, I'm sure if you've taken any philosophy courses, you've heard of Descartes. Descartes started off, interestingly enough, as a physiologist. He didn't start off as a philosopher, and he didn't really think of himself as a philosopher. He thought of himself as a mathematician and a scientist, and he believed that our bodies were completely distinct from our minds. That bodies, he thought, were mechanical, and that they were like mechanisms, and that animals without souls like ours were simply mechanical. and that understanding their mechanisms and understanding the laws that governed their mechanisms was something that you could do and create a kind of mathematics of mechanics, a mathematics of the body. And so he thought that we, human beings, were different from other animals because our souls allowed us to think. And our thinking souls then were separate from our bodies and were somehow in control of them at times, not exactly knowing how, but that was the situation that he had. So we are, in Descartes' terms, souls occupying our bodies. Our souls are immortal and our bodies are mortal for Descartes. And he tried to prove the existence of the external world by saying that if I think, therefore I exist, and therefore the world exists. So cogito ergo sum is the very famous line from Descartes. The person who put these two sets of ideas together, the idea of the body as a chemical retort and the idea of the body as a mechanism, was a very famous philosopher whose name is Robert Boyle. He was a philosopher-scientist. He is mostly known for the law that's called Boyle's law, which is the law that says that for a fixed amount of gas at a constant temperature, the pressure and volume of gas are inversely proportional. That's the statement of the law. What that means is that if you get a certain weight of gas and you put pressure on it, it'll become smaller in proportion to the pressure that you put and will become bigger as the pressure is released. And it's entirely proportional to that. That law made him famous. It also made him famous in history, but he also is renowned as the father of modern chemistry. But I would argue that he's also the father of the modern medical model. And that's what we're going to try to talk about. He brought together the ideas of Paracelsus and the ideas of Descartes. What we know about Boyle is really interesting. When he was in his early 20s, he became quite sick. He was affected by illness so much that he, in a way, began to think of himself as somebody who lived inside his body and thought of himself as separate from his body in the same way as Descartes did. And I think that partly because he did both chemistry and physics and medicine, he was probably the most critical contributor to how we understand, or how medicine understands, the human body today. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit more. The medical model of the body that he proposed was one that separated the person and the body, that we live inside our bodies, that our bodies are chemical, mechanical machines, and that health is the smooth running of that entire apparatus, okay, that has the correct chemical composition. Right? And to a certain extent, that model that was very important for medicine and for the kind of research that's been done in medicine is a model that has persisted until today. And it's just now beginning to change. We're just beginning to understand that that model is incomplete and that we have to think of other things that affect both our bodies and ourselves as persons, that we as persons are not seen just as spirits living inside these machines. Over the 200 years from the time of Boyle, most research was trying to find out more about the chemical mechanical body. Most of the research that was done, and most of the practice that was done, was to see the human body thinking of it in Boyle's terms of that model of the chemical mechanical body. And the ancient practice of medicine, the Galenic practice of medicine about using the humors, the four humors that Galen talked about, was the way in which medicine was practiced for much of these 200 years. So the practice of medicine was ancient Greek and Roman, and the theory of medicine, the model of medicine that people were doing research on, was the model that Boyle had developed. So practice continued to be non-scientific pretty much until about 1890. It's in the 1880s, there became a dramatic change in all of these things, and I'll talk a little bit about that. That came with the advent of modern surgery, the advent of the discovery of vaccines, and the proof of the germ theory, the introduction of public health, and the creation of the modern hospital. All of those things really made the Boyle's theory of model of the body, the chemical mechanical model of the body, the main way of thinking about the body in medicine. Between 1890 and 1975, pretty much, people thought of the body in those terms, that the doctor understood the functioning of the body and the functioning of the mechanisms and thinking about the right chemicals. The patient had very little to say and had a very tiny role in care and cure, except that they helped in the process of investigation by answering questions. And the patient had very little to do except follow medical orders. The treatment of heart events was seen as a breakdown of the pump in the mechanical body. And you don't want to run a pump unnecessarily if it tends to break down. So the treatment in the early 20th century for heart disease or heart attacks was bed rest. That you stayed in bed for 6 weeks after your heart attack, and that was very often followed by chair rest with very little walking, and then you did short walks as you became more fit. That picture of rehabilitation follows that model quite completely. Right? And the change didn't happen until late in the 20th century. In 1974, Canada led the way in beginning to change things. In Canada, a report was published called the Lalonde Report. How many of you have heard of it? A very few. So it's not at all well known anymore. But at the time, it had a huge impact on the world. That immediately after its publication, it was reported in newspapers across the world, and the idea that people could take some kind of responsibility for their own health was something that emerged from that time. And we'll talk about some of the changes. The ideas came from a man whose name was McEwen. He was a Scottish doctor who believed that people's health was not merely a function of the chemical mechanical model by itself, but that people could have some kind of responsibility for their own health. And that notion of having responsibility for your own health was something that began to change and put a slight dent into the model where the doctor had complete responsibility and complete knowledge for what you should do. McEwen thought that the fact that people were living longer was due to a whole bunch of lifestyle changes, the most important of which he thought was that people began to have fewer children, because that reduced child mortality and it reduced maternal mortality, for example. He also believed that people could take personal decisions about their diet and could take personal decisions about their lifestyle that would improve their health. And the Lalonde Report was the source of many recommendations along those lines. Before 1974, moderate exercise was considered to be going to the gym 3 times a month. And now, moderate exercise is going to the gym 3 times a week. And proper exercise is considered to be doing exercise 5 times a week at least, which you've learned here. Before 1974, most people ate mostly red meat and very little white meat. And they had far fewer vegetables and fruits than they do today. In 1974, in order to buy organic food, you had to go to the back part of a natural food store or a health food store in order to get it. And it wasn't available widely. Today, if you want to buy organic food, you just go to the supermarket, and there's an organic section in every supermarket, and there's now a Whole Foods just across the road from here, for example. So things have changed enormously since 1974, partly due to the introduction. I think the Lalonde Report was for healthcare something like Rachel Carson's book was for the environment, that it changed people's attitudes to their own responsibility for their health. And that was an enormous change. And there is some of that, what I've just said. Now we have another big change in technology. that not only can we contribute to our health in terms of exercise and diet, but we also have technology that allows us to do many more measurements of ourselves and to do many more diagnostic procedures for ourselves and separate from the medical institution. So for example, one of the things that is now available for your telephone is a thing that's an otoscope attachment to it, where you can take a picture of the inside of your ear or the inside of your child's ear and see whether or not there's an infection. The first stage of this was that the picture would be sent to your doctor and your doctor would diagnose the image. The second stage of it is that the collection of pictures that the company has of infected ears will be enough for the app itself to diagnose whether or not you have an ear infection, and you won't have to go to the doctor at all. Those changes are happening not just with otoscopes, they're happening with other things, other appliances that can be attached to telephones, so you can check your heart, you can check your heart rate, you can check your EKG, you can check other things that are going to emerge as these appliances become more effective. And you can take a lot more, you get a lot more understanding of various conditions or what your state of health is, apart from actually having to go to the doctor. But this is still inside that medical model, that the chemical balance is good and that mechanical parts are functioning well. And activities now are meant to achieve that end. And the activities include exercise and diet. And exercise is mechanical activities and diet is chemical activities, right? You're taking the right chemical ingredients into your body. At the same time as the Lalonde report came out, people were beginning to study the health status of people in the British Civil Service. There was a study called the Whitehall study that was done in the mid to late 70s, and that was published in around 1980, where what they did was they studied the health status of people in the British Civil Service. Everybody in the British Civil Service is employed. And everybody in the British Civil Service has a living wage. But it turned out that people who were at the top of the civil service had fewer heart incidents, lived longer, were healthier in many ways than people who were at the bottom of the civil service. And they couldn't find a single factor that would explain that. The factor that they thought of was that people at the top had more control over their work than people at the bottom. And that was the factor that they put forward, but it turned out that it really didn't fit. So they couldn't really figure out what the reason was that people at the top of the civil service were healthier than people at the bottom. They began to do more studies and discovered over time that there were many factors that resulted in inequalities in health. And they began to call these factors determinants of health. And over a period of time, about 5 years, they identified over 5,000 social determinants of health, that there are many, many different things that will have an impact on your health. But these things are not diet and exercise. They're your place in society, they have to do with your social relations, they have to do with all kinds of things that are separate from diet and exercise. And that became the kind of first stab at something that was talking about the model that's beyond the simple chemical mechanical model. And you had a picture of it at that time. The thing that was interesting about the inequalities in health work is that they argued for policies that would reduce inequalities in health by applying new ways of dealing with health. So for example, the program that we're all in is a program that's available to everybody in Canada. And programs like this and programs that will try to improve and help people's health by giving them more education and doing that and spreading them across what the inequalities for example, the British Civil Service were, so that everybody had access to this information, is something that is one of the consequences of that period of time. So far, so good? These are some of the determinants of well-being. they're not just determinants of health. So it turns out that this is a modified version of a Canadian group that talks about the factors that are relevant to people's well-being. And what they have is critically economic factors, that you have to have decent living standards, and it describes what these decent living standards are, like having adequate and safe housing, and having a living wage and a meaningful job, and so on. These economic factors are ones that are quite important in having in people's well-being, in living well. And there are developmental ones, like having access to education, and having a proper education is another factor. Having friends and loving relationships is a third factor. Participating in public life, having the capacity to participate in public life is another factor. And having access to health care is certainly a factor in people's well-being. And finally, having leisure and cultural activities is one of the factors. And each of these is divided up into other little pieces, which I won't go through today. But these are now described as factors in living well that are not simply chemical mechanical. And that suggests that we have to think of the model that we're using that places us in a chemical mechanical mode, when in fact other factors have quite a lot to do with well-being and ultimately in our health. There is a study that was done, that was started in 1938. It's called the Harvard Study. It's a study of people who are extraordinarily well off and at the top of society in the United States. There are 700 men who are graduates of Harvard, and some of their wives have been studied for almost 80 years. A second generation study has now started of the children of these people and their spouses and their families. And what the study did was to look at how they lived and look at their health status. And what they claim is the greatest contributor to both health and well-being into old age is having strong, loving relationships, close family ties, and good friendships for a very long time. Remaining happier and healthier into old age, that the people who had those kinds of characteristics lived happier and healthier into old age than those who did not. More recently, in the last few months, there's been work done in artificial intelligence, where what they've tried to do is to get Watson, the IBM brain, to understand more about what the contributors are to health. And they've done this by doing an analysis of what is called big data, large amounts of data, which is what Watson can analyze. And it was found that the success of Watson in being able to talk about the health status of people had 60% of it had to do with social determinants, only 40% had to do with chemical mechanical determinants of health. And so that change is really important. That change is really important to start to make us think about what is a proper model, what is a proper medical model to think about when we think about the health of population and the health of people. So what does it mean for you? Well, I think that the people in this room are a very interesting group, that you belong to a community, that in this group you come back for month after month to these lectures, and you know each other, a little bit, a lot, and you have contact with each other. That in itself is a critical contributor to your health. And what Rob does, and the work that he does, is actually contributing to your health in a way that's different from the formal rehabilitation process. It's not just the information that you get, which is largely about the chemical mechanical parts of your body. It's also about your interaction with each other and your interest in coming back here for having the companionship of other people who are in the same boat as you are. And me, I'm part of this too. So we have to think about what is an appropriate model of the human body. What is an appropriate model of understanding where our health comes from and where our well-being comes from? And we know already that it's not the smooth running of the chemical mechanical aspects of a person. It has a lot to do with how we live our lives. It has to do with the physical, social, intellectual, and other resources that we have and that we put into things. And that's what seems to be critical to making that difference. Here's my shot at it, and it's very early, and it's not that terrific, that a person is not a soul inside a chemical mechanical body, that the person is a person with a body, and that we are who we are, not just because of how we are structured. We are who we are and how we are because of who we relate to and how we relate to them. We don't learn a language except in interaction with other people. We don't learn our habits and how we live except in terms of the interaction with other people. So the quality of the interactions between a person and his or her various environments is a major contributor to health. That's my go at it. I don't know what you think about it, but that's where I am so far. So, and that's the last slide, is I think that you should have a healthy and a good life. Thank you. No, I could talk about genes. That it seems to me that the genetic work that's been done over the last 15 or 20 years, and I've studied it, is really interesting. And what it does is but it is on that model. It's on the same chemical mechanical model. So, and what it does is it goes much more finely into the mechanisms. Cancer research is another example of something that goes much more finely into the mechanisms. The thing that's interesting about gene research is that the result of genetic research is for tiny variations in outcomes, tiny variations in particular conditions, but they are there. So they're very important, and I'm not going to diminish their importance. But even the geneticists now say, absolutely, yeah, we don't. We don't. We don't have control over that. No, we don't. Yeah, yeah. I don't think that we certainly don't have control over our genetics.
Not yet.
Well, we're beginning. That's right. One of the things that is happening is that there's something called CRISPR that's allowing us to modify some of our genes and to change them. So the most recent work suggests that we'll be able to modify some of our genetic contexts, yeah, and start to deal with some of the problems that are clearly genetic. The fact is that the really important genetic impact is on a very, very small number of very rare diseases. In the same way as much of there's a book that was written on cancer called The Emperor of All Diseases. I don't know if you've seen it. But in that book, the man says that the reduction in smoking has had a greater impact on lung cancer than all of the research that's been done for the last 80 years. Sure, a lot of the interaction, yes, I mean, the idea of stress and the notion of the importance of stress and how stressors function on the body is that, yeah, it affects the chemistry of the body. The truth of the matter is that talk about stress is one of the things that works on this new model that we're trying to articulate, that changing the model and putting patients more, recognizing that patients and that people are not sitting simply inside this, but that how they live has an impact on it, is something that I think is very important. If you go back really, really far in history, Aristotle said that the point of living is to have a good life. And health is a contributor to a good life, but it's not the end of a good life, right? And one of the things that's happened in our society is that we've begun to confuse health with a good life. And it's a mistake. Yeah, that's right. But one of the things about the changes in the brain is that the changes in the brain that are described are changes that come as a result of social interaction. So that, yeah. And to some extent, the idea that there's an intermediary, there has to be some intermediary in this if we keep to that model. If we don't think of ourselves as social beings, that our brain changes as we learn language, for example. So that's to say that you can't learn language unless you live in a society. And that causes those brain changes. That we understand already. And the development of the brain continues well until we're 5 or 6 in terms of language learning, and it keeps on changing through our life. So the changes in our brain certainly have an impact, and have an impact on our health, but they also are impacted by our social environment. So the model that we have, which says that the body is a biomechanical object that has these kinds of things, is not enough. We have to understand what those social aspects are and what these other things are that do impact the body. Of course they do, yes. No, I think that there's a book been written about it by a man whose name is Atul Gawande. Have you heard of him? He writes for the New Yorker, and he wrote a book called Being Mortal, which is quite an interesting book. And what he argues is that the model that's used for nursing homes and for many retirement homes is a model that comes from the hospital. So the concern of the hospital and of many of these institutions is to keep people safe, not to provide them with a full rounded life. And so that has to do with, and it seems to me that that's a consequence of accepting the chemical mechanical model of the body. That if you have a richer picture of the fact that it's your social environment is really important to your health, then we would have to think about how we redesign nursing homes. And that's something that's beginning to happen. So there are movements afoot. So I'm not alone in this. I'm not alone. There are movements afoot to change the way in which nursing homes are organized, the way in which retirement homes are organized. And some of the attempts are to recognize the importance of the broad social life. So you have retirement homes. There's a retirement home in Oberlin, Ohio, for example, which feeds into the concert series that happened at the Oberlin Music School. So you're automatically bused to the concerts, and most of the people at the concerts are grayheads who aren't Oberlin students at all, but who come from this retirement village that's near Oberlin, that's put there exactly because these are people who love music and think that music should be a big part of their lives. The cancer book, it's called The Emperor of All Diseases. It's The Emperor of All Diseases. It's a terrific book. And he's just written the second book on genetics, and it's called Gene. So if you're talking about the importance of genetics, then that book Gene really talks about all of these things, except that genetics is moving quicker than the book. So he doesn't talk about the most recent changes in genetics yet, but he talks about everything up to that. He's an Indian guy. I'll try to remember his name. He has an East Indian name. Okay. That should be enough. And if you go to Amazon and you put in The Emperor of All Diseases, you'll get it. And if you put in Gene, you'll get the other book too. They're both very, very good books. The first one, The Emperor of All Diseases, won the Pulitzer Prize. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you say something more about moving away from this idea of keeping everybody safe, and you might call it the coddling?
Yes.
And I've seen other ways too, for young children.
Yes.
Moving away from the coddling.
Yes. Yeah. So that moving away is to recognize that you have to dare, to a certain extent. Well, one of the changes, for example, is that they would have nursing homes which are entirely on one floor, because they didn't want people to climb stairs. But climbing stairs is good for you. So climbing stairs. So now they're designing homes for older people that do have stairs, and not keeping them on one floor. Okay.
I remember reading something recently. One of my colleagues read about it, where they had a seniors' home, and it was very dry and sterile, as many of them are. And then they brought in plants and birds and everything like that. And every resident had to look after this bird and look after this plant.
Yeah.
And the results were fantastic.
Yeah. So just introducing other life is one of the things. I think that the possibility, Aristotle is really good on this stuff. He talks about he has two descriptions of old people. One description of old people is that you've lived a good life, and the time when you're older is a time to contemplate what your life was like and to appreciate it and to understand how you've come to live a good life, if you're lucky enough to have lived one. Luck has a big part to play in this, because it's not just effort, it's also luck. So, and he says that, but his description of old people who don't have a good life is devastating. The people who are miserable, who are miserly, who don't give anything away, who try to hold on to all of their goods, that those kinds of pictures of old people. So he has both pictures, and I think that we know old people who fit both pictures. but I think that this group, the group in this room, is another version of that. That this is a group that the questions and the fact that we have this interaction is part of that social intercourse and part of that value. And the value is not a value that's well recognized yet. Okay, but we know that it's there, and I think that things are beginning to change. So I'm quite optimistic. Now these changes take 50 to 100 years, so we probably won't be around when the new model comes out. But we're around enough to start to influence and recognize that a new model is necessary and that we have to change it. For example, here at the Rehab Institute, one of the things that I've argued is that we shouldn't be called patients, because we're no longer patients. We're in rehabilitation, right? But we shouldn't be given prescriptions for what we do. We should be advised about how our exercise should work. Those are the kinds of things that would start pushing towards a new model, even here. One of the issues that I'm really interested in is increasing lifespan, and in the middle of the 20th century, the argument that was that people were living longer because of public health, and public health was considered to be part of medicine and part of that model, So the measure of life expectancy at birth became a very important measurement for the health of the population. The longest lived people were now said to be in Japan. But the new statistics are saying that the longest lived people are people who will be born in 2030 in Korea. That women born in Korea in the year 2030 will live on average to the age of 90. Wow. On average to the age of 90. And so the question is, what is it about Korea that does that? And what is it about Japan that made people longest live there? And the answers have to do with these many, many, many determinants of health that are not chemical mechanical.
Wonderful. Dr. Gluberman, thank you very much.
Thank you.